Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Red Room Stories. I know many of you tune into these tales to help you drift off to sleep. So, before we settle in, I'd love for each of you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to give a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. The fog draped the valley in a gray veil, muting the world as Victor trudged through the damp grass. His lantern flickered in his hand, its glow barely piercing the haze, searching for his wife Mara, who disappeared after a panicked call about something in the mist. Her voice had trembled, cutting off with a sharp cry, leaving only silence on the line. The air was cold, thick with the scent of wet earth and a faint, bitter tang, urging him forward. He gripped Mara's hairpin, found snagged on a thorn bush, its metal cool against his skin, a tether to her absence. A whine sliced through the stillness, high and wavering, trembling the ground beneath Victor's boots. He halted, lifting the lantern, its light skimming the fog, revealing gnarled trees and a shallow trench cutting through the valley. The whine pulsed, thin and insistent, drawing him toward the gap where the mist swirled thicker. He shouted Mara's name, his voice muffled by the damp air, answered only by a soft scraping echo from the trench. His heart thudded, but he pressed on, the hairpin glinting faintly in his grasp. The trench sloped downward, its walls slick with mud, streaked with roots that glistened in the lantern's glow. Victor's light shook as he descended, spotting Mara's scarf, tangled in the roots, its edges frayed and damp with a dark, oily smear. The whine deepened, thrumming through the earth, and he knelt, peering into the shadows, the beam illuminating a tunnel that twisted into the dark, its walls shimmering with moisture. A rustle rose from within, slow and deliberate, and his breath caught, unease coiling in his chest. A shape flitted through the fog above, swift and angular, vanishing as Victor swung the light. The scrape came again, louder, joined by a hiss that slithered through the mist, alien against the valley's quiet. He called for Mara, his voice faltering, and the hiss turned into a murmur, soft and overlapping, rising from the tunnel. He stepped back, clutching the scarf, his boots sinking into the mud. The murmur grew, weaving with the whine, a chorus pressing against his ears. He edged toward the tunnel, the light catching on a ledge below, littered with debris bones, cloth, metal all coated in that oily smear. Victor's breath fogged as he spotted Mara's glove, its fingers curled, nestled among the remains. The murmur sharpened, and a hand darted from the dark, pale and clawing, scraping the ledge before retreating. He stumbled back, the lantern slipping, its glow spinning across the trench, the whine shaking the walls around him. Footsteps squelched behind him, slow and heavy, stirring the mud with each deliberate tread. Victor turned, the light quivering, glimpsing a figure tall, its limbs too thin, its head tilted unnaturally before it faded into the fog. The footsteps circled, closing in, and he bolted toward the tunnel, clutching the glove, the murmur rising into a wail that split the dusk. Shapes emerged along the trench's rim, their silhouettes swaying, too many to count, their presence a weight on the air. The tunnel swallowed him as he slid down its slope, the walls tight, the air thick with damp and rot. His light flickered, revealing gouges scratched into the stone frantic, crisscrossing, stretching deeper as he descended. The wail echoed, joined by a dragging scrape that sent chills up his spine. He landed in a chamber, its ceiling dripping, its floor slick with puddles that reflected the glow in oily swirls. Mara's coat lay crumpled in the center, soaked and heavy, surrounded by bones still wet with tissue. A figure crouched in the shadows, its form draped in rags, its head bowed over a pile of debris. Victor's light trembled as he approached, recognizing Mara's boots, but the figure turned, revealing a face of peeled skin and hollow sockets, its mouth gaping in a silent grin. It lunged, and he swung the lantern, cracking it against its skull, the glass shattering, plunging the chamber into darkness. The wail surged, shapes shifting in the black, their claws scraping stone as they closed in. He ran, hands groping for the tunnel. The creatures pursued, their scrapes and drags filling the air, their bodies pressing through the narrow passage. Victor clawed upward, the stone cutting his palms, the coat slipping as he reached the trench. He burst into the fog, the valley alive with movement figures swaying, their heads cocked, the wail a deafening roar. The ground quaked, the trench widening, swallowing the edges as he fled, the mist blurring around him. He tripped, tumbling into a gully, the glove glinting beside him in the mud. Victor crawled free, the valley endless under the gray shroud, the wine fading, the figures gone. His lantern lay broken, the glove clutched tight, its fabric warm against his skin. A farmer found him on a dirt path, soaked and muttering, the oily smear still clinging to his hands. He told his story at a roadside stall, the owner listening with a blank stare, pouring tea he didn't drink. The farmer glanced outside, the trench's faint outline in the distance, and stayed silent, his hands steady but pale. The next day, Victor led deputies to the trench, but the tunnel had vanished, the ground smooth, the bones and coat nowhere in sight. They shrugged, suggesting shock or the fog's deceit, but their eyes lingered on the glove, its smear faintly pulsing in the light. He returned home, the apartment cold, Mara's scarf inexplicably on the table, dry but heavy. Sleep eluded him, the wine echoing in his ears, the smear's chill lingering on his flesh. One night, the lights flickered, and the wine surged, rattling the walls. Victor grabbed a knife, the glove glowing faintly, its smear thrumming as shadows stretched across the room. The wail seeped through the floor, joined by scrapes against the windows, the ceiling, the door. He barricaded himself in, the knife raised, but the shadows thickened, hands pressing through the walls, pale and dripping. The windows fogged, mist swirling inward, and the lights died, the wine drowning his cries. Morning broke, the apartment empty, the knife on the floor, the glove gone. The door stood locked, the windows intact despite the fog. Victor vanished. A neighbor heard wails in the night, saw shapes slink toward the valley, but the deputies found no tracks, no trace. The case faded, lost to the trench's silence, its secrets buried beneath the damp earth. The valley stretched on, its fog rolling thick, whispering tales of lost souls and hidden depths. Victor's name joined the stories, carried on the wind, a caution etched into the twilight shroud. The dusk bled into the horizon, staining the sky crimson as Tara hiked through the tangled woods. Her flashlight jittered in her hand, its beam carving through the gloom, searching for her friend Jace, who'd vanished after a cryptic note about a find in the wilds. The note had been scrawled hastily, ending in a smear of ink, and now Tara was here, the air sharp with pine and a faint, sour rot. She clutched Jace's lighter, found flickering near a fallen log, its metal warm against her palm, driving her deeper into the trees. A groan rumbled through the earth, low and hollow, trembling the leaves beneath Tara's boots. She paused, sweeping the light across the woods, its glow catching on knotted branches and a clearing where the trees bent inward. The groan pulsed, slow and deep, pulling her toward the open space where shadows clung thick and still. She called Jace's name, her voice frail against the vastness, answered only by a faint, wet slap from the clearing's heart. Her pulse raced, but she pressed forward, the lighter clicking softly in her grip. The clearing was ringed with stones, smooth and pale, gleaming faintly under the fading light. Tara's beam shook as she stepped inside, spotting Jace's bandana, snagged on a root, its edges soaked with a dark, tacky film. He groan deepened, vibrating through her legs, and she approached the center, where a crack split the earth, its edges jagged and glistening. She aimed the light downward, the beam revealing a fissure that plunged into shadow, its walls slick with moisture. A rustle echoed from below, sharp and deliberate, and her stomach twisted. A shadow darted beyond the clearing, swift and low, vanishing as Tara swung the light. The slap came again, louder, joined by a hiss that slithered through the air, unnatural against the woods' quiet. She shouted for Jace, her voice cracking, and the hiss morphed into a murmur, soft and layered, rising from the crack. She stepped back, clutching the bandana, her boots sinking into the soft soil. The murmur swelled, blending with the groan, a chorus pressing against her skull. She leaned over the fissure, the light catching on a shelf below, littered with debris bones, fabric, metal all coated in that dark film. Tara's breath clouded as she spotted Jace's knife, its blade bent, tangled in the mess. The murmur sharpened, and a hand burst from the dark, pale and clawing, scraping the shelf before retreating. She stumbled back, the flashlight slipping, its beam spinning across the clearing, the groan shaking the stones around her. Footsteps crunched behind her, heavy and uneven, snapping twigs with each slow stride. Tara turned, the light trembling, glimpsing a figure tall, its limbs too long, its head lolling before it melted into the dusk. The footsteps circled, tightening around her, and she bolted toward the crack, clutching the knife, the murmur rising into a wail that tore through the night. Shapes loomed along the clearing's edge, their forms swaying, too many to track, their presence a weight on the air. The fissure beckoned, and Tara slid down its slope, the walls closing tight, the air thick with damp and decay. Her light flickered, illuminating gouges scratched into the stone wild, overlapping, stretching deeper as she descended. The wail echoed, joined by a dragging scrape that sent shivers down her spine. She landed in a chamber, its ceiling low, its floor slick with puddles that shimmered under the beam. Jace's jacket lay in the center, soaked in dark film, surrounded by bones still wet with marrow. A figure hunched in the shadows, its frame cloaked in tatters, its head bowed over a pile of remains. Tara's light quaked as she approached, recognizing Jace's boots, but the figure turned, revealing a face of cracked flesh and hollow sockets, its mouth gaping in a toothless grin. It lunged, and she swung the flashlight, cracking it against its skull, the bulb shattering, plunging the chamber into darkness. The wail surged, shapes shifting in the black, their claws scraping stone as they closed in. She ran, hands fumbling for the fissure. The creatures chased, their scrapes and drags filling the air, their bodies crowding the tight passage. Tara clawed upward, the stone cutting her palms, the jacket slipping as she reached the surface. She burst into the clearing, the woods alive with movement figures swaying, their heads tilted, the wail a deafening roar. The ground trembled, the crack widening, swallowing the stones as she fled, the dusk blurring around her. She tripped, tumbling into a ditch, the knife glinting beside her in the dirt. Tara crawled free, the woods endless under the crimson sky, the groan fading, the figures gone. Her flashlight lay broken, the knife clutched tight, its blade warm against her skin. A hiker found her on a trail, dust-caked and muttering, the dark film still clinging to her hands. She told her story at a ranger station, the staff listening with furrowed brows, offering water she didn't drink. The hiker glanced outside, the clearing's faint outline in the distance, and stayed quiet, his hands steady but pale. The next day, Tara led rangers to the clearing, but the fissure had vanished, the ground smooth, the bones and jacket nowhere in sight. Clara shrugged, suggesting exhaustion or a trick of the light, but her eyes lingered on the knife, its sheen faintly pulsing in the sun. Evelyn returned home, the apartment cold, Isaac's scarf inexplicably on the table, dry but heavy. Sleep evaded her, the drone echoing in her ears, the sheen's chill lingering on her skin. Then she found a note in Isaac's handwriting. Look for me where the shadows hum-slipped under her door. One night, the lights dimmed, and the drone surged, rattling the walls. Evelyn grabbed a blade, the knife glowing faintly, its sheen thrumming as shadows stretched across the room. The wail seeped through the floor, joined by thuds against the windows, the ceiling, the door. She barricaded herself in, the blade raised, but the shadows thickened, hands pressing through the walls, pale and dripping. The windows cracked, dust swirling inward, and the lights died, the drone drowning her cries. Morning broke, the apartment empty, the blade on the floor, the knife and note gone. The door stood locked, the windows intact despite the cracks. Evelyn vanished. A neighbor, old Mrs., Tate heard wails in the night, saw shapes slink toward the hills, but the rangers found no tracks in Lee Amos, standing at the ravine, staring into its depths with a knowing look. He muttered about Tara, his own sister lost years ago, hinting she'd been the eyeless figure Evelyn described, twisted by something ancient beneath the earth. The hills stretched on, their shadows long and still, whispering tales of lost souls and hidden depths. Evelyn's name joined Tara's in the stories, carried on the wind, a warning etched into the dusk's shroud. Amos lingered at the ravine, his lantern flickering, drawn by the hum he'd ignored too long, his own fate teetering on the edge as the shadows swayed once more. In the small, secluded town of Black Hollow, nestled deep within a dense, ancient forest, the air always carried a chill, even in the height of summer. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the woods, warning their children never to venture too far. Among them was Eliza, a curious and headstrong teenager who had always been drawn to the mysteries of the forest. Her best friend, Marcus, was more cautious, but Eliza's determination often dragged him into her adventures. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Eliza convinced Marcus to explore an abandoned cabin deep in the woods, a place rumored to be cursed. The cabin was as foreboding as the story suggested, with its rotting wooden planks and shattered windows. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers filled the room. Marcus urged Eliza to leave, but she was captivated by an old journal she found on a dusty table. The entries spoke of a shadowy figure that haunted the woods, a being that could mimic voices and lure its victims deeper into the forest. Eliza laughed it off, but Marcus's unease grew as the whispers grew louder, almost as if they were calling their names. Days passed, and Eliza began to act strangely. She would disappear for hours, returning with mud-stained clothes and a distant look in her eyes. Marcus noticed she would mutter to herself, repeating phrases from the journal. One night, he followed her into the woods and watched in horror as she stood before the cabin, speaking to the shadows. The whispers grew deafening, and Marcus saw a figure emerge from the darkness, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. He tried to call out to Eliza, but his voice was swallowed by the cacophony of whispers. The next morning, Eliza was gone. The townsfolk organized a search party, but no trace of her was found. Marcus, racked with guilt, returned to the cabin alone. Inside, he found the journal, now filled with new entries in Eliza's handwriting. They detailed her descent into madness, how the shadowy figure had promised her power and knowledge in exchange for her soul. The final entry was a warning. It's coming for you next. As Marcus read those words, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. He fled the cabin, but the whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. Weeks turned into months, and Marcus became a shell of his former self. He rarely left his house, and when he did, he would hear Eliza's voice calling to him from the woods. One night, unable to resist any longer, he followed the voice deep into the forest. There, standing before the cabin, was Eliza, what was left of her. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pale and translucent, as if she were fading into the shadows. She smiled at him, a cold, lifeless smile, and whispered, "Join me." Marcus tried to run, but the shadows closed in around him, their whispers drowning out his screams. The next morning, the townsfolk found Marcus's empty house, the door wide open and muddy footprints leading into the woods. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed, but the whispers remained, carried on the wind. To this day, the people of Black Hollow avoid the forest, especially at night, when the shadows seem to move on their own and the whispers grow louder, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. And sometimes, if you're unlucky, you might see two figures standing at the edge of the woods, their hollow eyes watching, waiting for their next victim.